done a blind taste test?
Yes.
Yes, most of you have. Well, early in my youth ministry career, some of the other youth leaders and I were planning an overnight walk-in, and we had to keep these teenagers busy, so we created an enormous race through town. And in each place that they had to go, they had some obstacle they had to overcome before they could go to the next place. Well, the last challenge at the last stop was a number of food items placed on the table in front of them. And they had to pick 2 items that as a team they would consume in their entirety. Seemed like an easy challenge. And of course they thought the way it works is that the first team there gets the easiest, best items to eat, and the rest get the grosser items. But they were in for a bit of a surprise. You see, we had done what we could to disguise the items. One I remember that was particularly cruel was a yogurt cup that we had emptied of yogurt filled with mayonnaise. I still remember the startled looks on those faces. Because that team who thought they got off easy picking a little container of yogurt started to eat the mayonnaise. There's a lot of gagging and complaining and moaning. Sometimes things certainly aren't what they appear. Dan Ariely, in a recent TED Talk, showed a chart of people's beer preferences if you ask them which brand they like. And the dots were all over the place, here and here and here and here, all over. And then he showed that same chart, but when they did a blind taste test, when they couldn't see the brands. And the dots went from out here to in here. There was still a little discrepancy when they were here and here and here and here. Blind taste tests are a much more honest reflection of our prejudices. Because our eyes and our expectations, our stereotypes, can deceive us. Sometimes we think our sight helps us navigate through life so much better. But it's only when we turn off our physical eyes that we discover what our other senses are really sensing, including our heart. I love this episode in the Gospels. 2 disciples have left the chaos and the fear and the grief in traumatized Jerusalem, and they're headed home to Emmaus. Something a lot of us do. We're feeling fearful or full of sadness. And they're no doubt carrying all of that from Jerusalem back to Emmaus with them. They're not the disciples in Jesus' inner circle. We've never heard their names before in the gospel accounts. But they are close enough, apparently, to have heard the testimony of the women who went to the garden one Easter morning about a tomb and an angel proclaiming, "He is risen." Some in their group have even gone to see the empty tomb and confirmed with their own eyes that it is indeed empty. Would it have mattered if these 2 disciples had gone themselves, seen with their own eyes the emptiness of the tomb? I doubt it. Just like us, they have such deeply ingrained expectations. What they had seen with their own eyes was that Jesus was crucified and died. They can only make one meaning out of that. That this person, Jesus, whom they thought was the Christ, a Savior to rescue them from Rome and everything that oppressed them, that he had been an imposter. After all, in their sacred text in Deuteronomy, they are told that those who are crucified are cursed by God. I think it's a little like a fan watching their underdog team lose in the playoffs. They're heading home, heads hung low. The person on whom they pinned so many hopes a prophet, someone everyone thought was the Messiah, rise and fall. And even though the good news is there for the seeing in the empty tomb, and there for the hearing in the words of those women who went to the garden, they failed to perceive it. I imagine many of us would too. I think I probably would. It's so human for us to create lenses of expectation through which we interpret the world around us. Eyes and ears have not worked to recognize the life of Christ still with them. So we're told when they meet this man on the road home to Emmaus, their eyes are turned up. They're kept from recognizing that it's actually Jesus with them. I imagine God may have been having a little fun, performing a bit of a blind Jesus test. And even when their hearts start to burn as they sense Jesus in this man, their eyes keep them from accepting what their hearts are sensing. Dan Early, in that TED Talk I mentioned earlier, describes how his research team applied that blind taste test idea to questions about equality and inequality. They asked a whole variety of people a number of questions about how they perceive inequality. And of course, people perceive less inequality than there really is in terms of wealth and access to education and healthcare. But what they really wanted to know was how much equality or inequality do we want? Do we as a society want? But they couldn't just ask people that, because people's own biases and their own selfish motivations would keep them from answering neutrally. And so instead, they posed the question like this. If you were to enter an ideal society, and you didn't know where you were going to enter, if you were going to enter the bottom 10% or the top 10%, how much inequality would you want? And people still were okay with a certain level of inequality, but far, far less than they perceived, and far, far less than is reality for us. Sometimes blindness is the only way we can turn on the eyes of our heart. Get outside ourselves enough to discover compassion and empathy and a shared humanity. Over and over again in the gospel stories, people describe their encounters with the risen Christ, and they fail to recognize him immediately. They fail to recognize him with their five senses. They have to feel around in the dark until they find their way with their heart. How true that is for many of us in our faith journeys. And how often, I wonder, are we walking with Christ, unaware of his presence with us? Both of my grandmothers died of Alzheimer's. And one developed it quite early in life. She was only 65. I remember going to see her toward the end of 10 years with the illness. And she had lost the ability to speak coherently. But she would sit in the nook of this Alzheimer's unit that they had turned into a nursery with a crib and a rocking chair and baby dolls. And she would sit there cradling one of those dolls and cool it. And when we would come to visit, she would hold it up for us and smile when she was introducing this wonderful, special person to all of these strangers. If you have a family with Alzheimer's, you know I had changed so much from the time I was 10 when she was diagnosed to the time when I was 20, the last time I visited her. It was, of course, even more heart-wrenching for my mom and my uncle and my grandmother. But every once in a while, a touch or a word of love would spark something in her. And she would look at us, and waves of recognition would pass across her face. As if just for a moment, that veil had been lifted and her memory restored. Her hand, as it so often did in my childhood, would reach out and cradle the face of that person and look with such a fierce love. It always amazed me that even when so much had been lost, the eyes of her heart could still probe through the darkness and find us. I always wondered what triggered that reaction. For the disciples, the wisdom of this man they meet on the way home stirs something in them. A glimmer of recognition. Something wise and inspiring and comforting. Enough for them to beg this man to stay with them. As I pored over this passage this week, after following Holy Week and our journey into Easter, those words really stood out to me. Stay with us. The same words Jesus uttered in the garden to his friends. Stay with me. Jesus must have recognized something of himself in their grief and their fear, in their need for companionship. Though he had been talking with them all day long, it's not until he stays with them as a companion, providing the love and the community they desperately crave and need in the midst of their grief, that the eyes of their heart are opened. It's not until he breaks that bread in the way that he had taught his disciples to do, with compassion and love and grace, with the promise that this broken body, his broken body, would feed the world, with that tender touch of servant love, with the hope that breaks into the darkness of their blindness, and the love that illuminates the reality that at this table of equality and life, this community, they are sitting in the presence of love incarnate. You know, it's so opposite of what Jesus said to the disciples over and over again during his ministry of teaching. He would always tell them that they could see with their eyes and hear with their ears, but they weren't perceiving with their hearts. But now those senses are turned off. And in that blind taste test of the bread of life, they learn to use the eyes of their heart. Later, the other disciples will also. In their wounded grief, they will recognize the wounds of love incarnate among them and feel the peace that this one offers. They will share a meal with this one and taste what a life of love and hope and grace tastes like. They will go out to be witnesses of these things. They'll go out to speak to people's hearts the way Jesus has spoken to theirs. So I'm really glad if you brought some doubts with you this morning. I'm really glad if you brought some fears and questions with you to our sacred sacred space this morning. And it's okay if you're having trouble grasping Jesus' presence, love's presence here with us this morning with those 5 senses. It's okay if you look at your life or around at the world and can only paint a bleak picture, if that's the only meaning you can make. And it's okay, right now at the end of my sermon, if you have one foot out the door and at home, it's okay. It's a very disciple thing to do. Jesus will meet us here, or on the road, or in our homes, or at our tables, or in those places where we lock ourselves away. We may feel drawn to this one's wisdom, comforted or inspired by the story of life he leaves. And if we listen, if we taste and look with our hearts, we might just recognize love's unbelievable presence here with us. In something as simple as sharing a meal,